All right, so the name of my talk is Hacking Your Brain with Science, or more specifically, brain science. And just a bit of a PSA before I start, your mind will change after this talk is over. All right, so how did this start? I do technical writing for a couple of tech blogs, and one of them is a blog called raywinterlick.com, which is kind of an iOS place where people go. And I was on the article team at one point, and I saw this wish list of articles, and one of them was how to keep learning after 50. And I thought, I'm over 50. I could probably do this article. And then I thought to myself, as I took on the assignment, I kind of thought twice about the bias in the title, in the subject matter, because I've been able to learn things and keep learning throughout my entire life, and I don't feel that I've slowed down. In fact, I've probably gotten a lot better, and you'll see why in the last 5 or 6 years. In fact, as sort of a milestone, when I think about it, I didn't even publish my first iOS app until after my 50th birthday. So the whole thing about not being able to teach an old dog a new trick doesn't seem to hold water. So I reached out to a bunch of my colleagues, and who are also graybeards, and I said, how do you guys keep learning? And a number of them talked to me about, how they, keep up with websites, and they read books, and they keep practicing, learning new code, learning new languages, that kind of stuff. And as you can see on the board here, these are all the jobs I've had in my entire life. I forgot to mention at one point I was actually a parking lot attendant, but so one of my friends who I went to high school with, and then eventually went to university with, he makes banjos, and he was telling me about how he'd stumbled across this new way of learning. Well, not new; it's new based on science, and he pointed me to this idea of neuroplasticity, and basically how your brain is basically plastic, right? Um, and it's basically the name of the science for the plasticity of the brain, or how brains form new pathways, how they construct them. And, for example, in a brain trauma incident, if somebody has a stroke or they have an accident or whatever, it is possible to retrain their brain at any age to create new pathways. And that's a science called cortical remapping. And so the TLDR for this talk is it's all about plastics. And of course, if anybody gets the reference to this slide, you'll get the joke. So going back to my friend with the banjos, he told me about this scientist named Josh Turknet, who has a website and does some pretty lame videos, but he's actually a brain scientist. He's a neuroplasticist or neurologist, and he talks about Brain Joe as this course that he's got on how to learn how to play different methods of banjo. And he dispels some of the myths that about learning any kind of musical instrument. And one is that musical ability is not innate. It's not something that you're born with or a capability you're born with, which is the sort of the myth, you're an artist because you have a natural talent for it. But I've gone through this in my previous life as well, that anybody can learn how to draw. The thing is, we all know how to draw when we're kids. We're taught that we can't draw in school, and we give up on it. We walk away from that. And another example of how cortical mapping works is when babies are learning how to talk. They start by forming sounds, they start by mumbling, and they start mimicking what their parents are doing to the point where they actually start to form words, and then the parents go crazy, or they can start to form sentences. And so another thing that he talks about in his Brain Joe course is that the classical method of training musicians is actually pretty ineffective because the way we all sort of think we learn is, we do a 24-hour binge, or we binge a subject on the weekend, and by Monday we're experts at it. And the reality is by Thursday we've completely forgotten what we learned. And the reason why, he says, is because using neuroplasticity, he's determined that in his brain show technique, the best, most optimal way of learning is to learn in short sessions, like 40 minutes a day. But the thing is, repeat those sessions over a week, practice daily, that kind of stuff. And rather than trying to do a big long binge of learning, learning in small amounts. And one of my agile jokes that I like to tell is how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat an elephant one bite at a time because obviously it's a big task, right? So you break down what you're learning into simple parts rather than try to be a master all at once. I think is the sort of takeaway from this particular talk. And in doing the research on this particular subject for this article I was writing, I also stumbled across another scientist named Dr. Laura Boyd, who is at UBC. And one of the things that she talks about in her talk is that, the 10,000 hours, the Malcolm Gladwell thing, do any one activity for 10,000 hours and you're an expert. And she points out that it's not that simple. Um, and again, also just a sort of caveat about this subject matter is while these techniques are working for me, I've been using them for, like I said, the last 5 or 6 years, and things are really going well. Each person's brain is slightly different. So this isn't like a magic bullet, these techniques I'm talking about, but it does give you, hopefully it educates you in terms of how your brain works, and you can start to use some of these techniques to learn new languages, learn new instruments, learn songs that you need to perform. And it's our behaviors that change the way our brain connects and how learning is formed. And as she likes to say during her talk, after watching her video, your brain will not be the same. So she's a researcher at the University of British Columbia. She works with stroke patients, and one of the things that she says is, we've learned so much about strokes and about how to recognize them and how to prevent them, how to catch them early, as it were, that they've been able to move strokes from the number 3 most common way that people die to the number 4. So they're making progress, but there's still a lot to learn, still a lot they don't know. She just says, we're basically getting better at discovering what causes strokes, what the signs and symptoms are, and how to get in there quick. They're still not able to prevent strokes, and so she looks at how do stroke patients recover from this? And again, she's a neuroplasticity, a neuroscientist as well. And so she talks about, waiting for the slide to change, how memory actually works. And one of the first things she talks about is that, as you may know, you have neurons in your brain, and how you form a memory of anything, like what you had for breakfast this morning or what color the shirt the guy next to you is wearing, is you form a chemical bond in your brain. You make a chemical structure or chemical connection between neurons, and that's basically how a short-term memory is formed. And if from daily life that you may not remember what you had for breakfast, well, that's because your brain is kind of a trickster, and I like to think of it as a trickster. Is it in that it basically only remembers the things that it thinks are important. So again, through these techniques, you're going to learn to reinforce the things you want to remember or want to learn or want to unlearn. And so a chemical connection, after a couple of days or a couple of hours, it'll basically just go away. It's not a formal memory in your brain. So the next type of thing that the brain does, memory work. Next time, like memory is a structural memory, and where your brain actually makes a physical change in the brain. It makes a permanent record in the formation of neurons. And I like to think of this as kind of like the difference between a cache and writing something to disk, right? So if you think about it this way, your brain creates these structures, and then as it recognizes that things become more important, you start to form these more permanent changes in your brain. And, so if this is basically how long-term memories are formed. And different parts of your brain do different things. And then once you take all these sort of structural memories or structural connections and you put them together into behaviors, you create functional changes in your brain, where your brain takes several regions of your brain and creates certain skills. For example, we call these muscle memory, you've probably heard that term many, many times. And one of the things these scientists can do by looking at the actual structure of the brain is they notice that people who speak Braille have or read Braille, they have a different, the parts of their brain are more structured in handling that kind of thing. For instance, the other thing is your dominant side, like if you're right-handed, the left side of your brain is your dominant side, it'll have more of these structures in there because you've learned things over your lifetime. And another example is London taxi drivers, in order to get their license, they have to memorize the London map. And so the part of the brain that holds maps is much more structured in those kind of people. So to reiterate, the chemical changes are sort of the quick little, things that your brain does. But over time, with repeated practice, again, going back to what Dr. Turcotte was saying about the 40-minute practicing, repeating daily, this is how you'll form structures, and eventually, you do things like you learn how to drive a car, for example, right, which requires multiple types of things. So these things, chemical, structural, and functional changes, they basically support this sort of practice idea of your brain or your brain growing. And there's a lot of questions about, I guess, the independency or independent brains in terms of how they all work. Like it raises a lot of questions like, how is it possible that you can learn some things easier than other things, and why do kids sometimes fail at things? Why do we forget things? And how does the brain recover from a brain damage event or from a severe event, right? And it comes down to your behavior. Behavior is your primary driver. So practice, as I said, not not a silver bullet, but practice is the one thing. You have to do the work in order to get to do that, to work. And I mean, the caveat about neuroplasticity, it can be a positive thing, it can also be a negative thing. It can also be leading you into addictions and all kinds of other negative traits as well, right? So it can also be what you don't do is part of that. And recently, I've been playing around with this, and during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, I went and I realized I couldn't play music with my friends because we couldn't get together and practice. So I went out and bought myself a digital set of drums, and I also bought a keyboard and like for piano. And I found a couple of courses online. One's called Melodics, and the other one is an app from Gibson that runs on your iPad or your phone. And both of these use neuroplasticity and these kind of techniques where a little bit of practice each day, you'll start to learn how to play these different instruments. The drums is the hardest one because obviously, drums is a whole body instrument. Your left arm, your right arm, your left leg, your right leg are all moving in different times and hitting different drums in different positions in the space in front of you. But using this Melodics app, which also works for keyboards, by the way, I was able to teach myself to play piano with two hands or play drums with all four limbs, which at the beginning was a bit tough, but I kept at it. You may find also if you play video games, when you first start playing a video game, you're starting to learn what the controls are. After, a week or so of playing the game repeatedly every night or something like that, the controls become second nature and you become a real sort of expert at it, right? And another example from sports is Wayne Gretzky. Like I like to say, everything I learned playing hockey. And what Wayne Gretzky used to do is beyond all the sort of things you've heard about him is, and this is a Canadian connection I've just thrown up here, but Gretzky would get on the ice before the rest of the players, and he would get off the ice after the players. And one of the things that you would see him doing a lot would be he would take a bucket of pucks and he would practice shooting at like one of the top corners of the net repeatedly over and over and over again. And in the same sense, Kawhi Leonard would have done something very similar, trying 3-point shots from the corner, right? So they do this repeatedly so that by the time, they develop this one little tiny skill, which seems to be pretty minor, but, at the moment when in a game, Kawhi Leonard has to run to the corner and make that jump shot to beat the buzzer in the semifinals and win the game. I mean, to us, that seems like magic, but when you think about it, he's used neuroplasticity. He's used this whole science of repeated actions to develop this skill over time. Obviously, we're not like Wayne Gretzky or Kawhi Leonard. It's a little bit more. They do have some natural talent there, I guess. But it's the repeated practice over and over again that they did this. And like babies learn to speak, they're developing micro skills, right? So another example I like to use is learning to drive. When you first get your license, you know nothing about driving. You're both hands on the steering wheel. You're white knuckling down the road. And after, you get your license, you get more confident, you start driving more and more daily. Every day you're driving to work, to get to the point where you don't even remember the drive to work because it's become such an innate part of your daily practice. And another thing, as I mentioned before, because I've gone through various different languages over my lifetime of coding, right now, I mean, like even in iOS, I've gone from Objective C to Swift UI in 10 years, as well as PHP and JavaScript and Java and HTML and CSS, and I can list a ton of languages, and I'm sure you guys have all sort of experienced the same thing. But the trick to learning these codes, as I said before, is not to just go and do it like what do you call those things? Just go and do like a giant course and think that's what's going to be. It's repeated practice over and over again, same sort of thing. There's apps like Duolingo and where you can learn a new language. You can learn to speak French. You can learn to speak Portuguese. When I was going on vacation a couple of years ago, I pulled out the Duolingo app and I started learning Portuguese. And so that by the time we got off the plane, we had to go to the grocery store to buy groceries. I understood how to recognize milk and eggs and low fat milk and that kind of stuff, right? And the picture of me here is I'm not a bass player. I happen to have a really nice bass, as you can see, but I'm a guitarist, and I've played and sing in front of people. And I had an assignment to put on a talent show or put on a concert before 600 of my colleagues, and we were learning a bunch of songs, and we weren't really sure who was going to play bass and who was going to play guitar or whatever. So I took it upon myself to use these neuroplasticity techniques to learn some of the songs we were going to play. I learned the bass parts, like for 2 weeks before the day. And then on the day, we decided, okay, well, it's going to be too hard for us to change guitar. So I just played bass for the whole thing. And so this is me playing and singing in front of people with something that I used this technique to teach myself over a couple of weeks before the actual event. And I also taught we had typing class in high school, but we didn't have computers until I graduated university, right? So I never bothered learning to touch type, but about 2 years ago, I guess, I started teaching myself using this technique again. I found an app that would basically let me do a little bit at a time, one letter at a time, left and right hand. And now I've got to the point where I've been typing over the years because, naturally, if you're a coder, you have to type. But I now can actually touch type and take notes with both hands on the keyboard, which is something that I think is quite an accomplishment. You may also have heard about a program called Noom, which is if you're on Facebook and you're thinking about dieting, you probably have been inundated with commercials. Well, I gave Noom a try a couple of times last year, and it basically is the same thing. It uses neuroplasticity, it uses a little bit of psychology, education about food to change your habits, which is another important part of this. You can also use it to change habits. And I've lost 40 pounds. I'm not a dieter. I don't like to exercise. But this Noom program mixed with the psychology and the neuroplasticity has enabled me to do what I, for the most of my life thought would be impossible, and that's losing weight. Mentioned Duolingo already. Mask wearing was something during the pandemic. I think we all, through repeated mask wearing, got comfortable with the idea. If you think about it, in 2019, if somebody said you'd be wearing a mask every day, you'd go, no way, not me, right, kind of thing. And then in the middle of the pandemic, I felt uncomfortable if I went outside and I wasn't wearing a mask. And another thing I want to talk about is this my latest hack, which is mind mapping. And I've been curious about mind mapping, and it's another way of it's a type of note taking that's based on the way your mind works, right, and how you structure things. And so I even used mind mapping in preparing this talk today. So the idea is you start with the concept in the center in the little square there, brain hacking. Apologies for not being able to read my handwriting. It'll get better in a minute. But how I planned this talk and how I'm going through the talk right now is I sat down on the weekend and I went through and I structured all the points that come off of this and go through each point. And that's how I'm able to pace my talk, get through the talk, and actually even create this presentation using mind mapping. And it's more in tune with the way your brain works as opposed to just plain note taking. So here's another, like there are applications out there that do this as well. This is the same chart from the talk, done in MindMeister. There's a number of apps out there, and you can see that it's the same sort of concept of all the stuff I'm talking about. I'm just flipping through some of the different kinds of styles that you can use as well. But you can see that it's enabled me to create a structured plan for this whole talk as we go through it. And so the coming back to the sort of summary of what this is all about is, and this is taken right from Laura Boyd's video. Study how and what you learn best, and repeat those behaviors that are healthy for your brain, and break those that are not. That's like quit smoking and that kind of thing. And learning is about doing the work that your brain requires, and you and your plastic brain are shaped by the world around you. So practice, practice, practice. Unfortunately, you can't get away from that, but hopefully I've given you the sort of tools to think about how to more effectively practice, right? And her advice and my advice to you is go out and build the brain that you want. And here are some resources to the talk that I did on learning after 50, and then the Brain Joe video, and as well Dr. Laura's talk at TEDx, which talks about how the brain actually works. And that's the end of my talk. This is me. Have a great day. By the way, I'm Tim Mitra on Mastodon as well as Twitter. And nobody's mentioned Mastodon yet today, but there you go. That's it. Any questions?